Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're setting up shop in our study hall segment.
That's right, specifically Bills on the Hill.
Exactly. And the mission, like always in study hall, is pretty straightforward. We figure out what recent legislation actually, does.
And crucially, based only on the text and the analysis in the materials you shared with us. No outside opinions here.
Precisely. Today, we're looking closely at your sources about Title X of a recent act. It seems to focus heavily on transportation and infrastructure.
So our goal for this deep dive is to pull out the key pieces of information from these documents.
Helping you understand the funding decisions, the, strategic priorities, operational changes.
Yeah.
All laid out in Title X strictly through the lens of this material.
Okay, let's unpack it. Let's see what your sources show about where the money's going and, why it seems to matter according to this text.
Right. Let's kick things off with a big focus in Title X, the United States Coast Guard. Your sources really highlight some significant funding appropriations for various Coast Guard assets, specifically for fiscal year 2025.
And what jumps out immediately, based on the material you provided, is how explicitly it connects this funding to, key operational needs.
Yeah, the sources tie these appropriations directly to things like securing maritime borders, interdicting migrants and drugs, other ops.
With a specific mention of strategically important areas, like the Arctic.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting, looking at how the money is actually, divided up within that Coast Guard section. Your sources break it down by asset type.
And the biggest single number for a specific asset category really stands out. It's a huge amount, $4,978,000.
Almost $5 billion. For what specifically?
For Arctic security cutters and domestic icebreakers.
Wow. Okay. And that's not all for ice-capable ships, is it?
No. If you add the $4,300,000,000 allocated for polar security cutters.
Doing the math quickly, that's over $9.2 billion total. Explicitly for vessels designed for icy regions, according to these documents.
Exactly. So what does that suggest, based only on your sources?
Well, the material strongly indicates a major strategic focus on boosting the Coast Guard's presence and their operational capability in the Arctic and Antarctic.
And the sources imply this focus is likely driven by factors they actually mention, like, growing geopolitical interest up there, more shipping traffic because the ice is receding.
And just the basic need for sovereignty patrols, search and rescue, law enforcement in those really tough environments.
But just buying new ships isn't the whole story, is it? What about the support? What do the sources say about keeping these things running?
Absolutely key point. And the material you shared makes it clear Title X isn't just about the cutters. There are substantial investments in the supporting infrastructure and maintenance. Critical stuff.
Right. Your sources detail, over $3.1 billion for shoreside infrastructure?
Yeah, covering design, planning, engineering, construction, program management, funds for hangars, maintenance spots, crew facilities.
Even home ports specifically for these new polar cutters on training facilities, too.
And then there's another pot, $1.3 billion for depot maintenance. That covers aviation assets, the cutters themselves, shoreside facilities, and C5I systems.
C5I, command, control, communications, computers, cyber, and intelligence. So maintaining all those complex systems.
Exactly. But what really stands out in that maintenance section, according to your sources?
It's a specific carve-out. $500 million. $500 million.
To do what?
To acquire, procure, or construct a floating dry dock.
A floating dry dock. And the purpose is spelled out in the material.
Yes, explicitly. It's for maintaining and repairing the offshore patrol cutters, the OPCs, and the national security cutters, NSCs.
And your sources make a point about the OPCs, don't they?
They do. They specifically highlight that OPCs are key assets used for those missions we mentioned earlier, interdicting migrants and drugs.
So this dedicated dry dock funding, and it even includes money for dredging the channel to get ships to it.
It really underscores a critical logistical need identified in the bill. It looks like a strategic move to make sure these high-value assets, the ones doing those interdiction missions, stay operational.
Okay, so the funding is there for the assets and the support. How does Title X approach actually getting these things built or acquired, especially those new Arctic cutters in the dry dock?
Well, your sources point to some flexible procurement provisions in Title X as a key mechanism here.
Flexible how?
For the Arctic security cutters' domestic icebreakers and that floating dry dock, the material says the Commandant of the Coast Guard can use entities other than the Coast Guard itself.
For acquisition, procurement, or construction.
Correct. And it says this is allowed notwithstanding certain restrictions or specific sections of Title 14, United States Code.
Okay, let's unpack that. Title 14 is the main law governing the Coast Guard, right? Including how they usually buy things.
Exactly. So allowing them to bypass specific restrictions in Title 14, as your sources indicate, is interpreted in the material as a strategic way to possibly speed things up.
Accelerate or facilitate acquisition, maybe by sidestepping the usual methods or bringing in outside expertise.
That seems to be the implication in the sources. The legislation is explicitly providing sort of alternative paths, potentially to get these key assets faster. And for the dry dock, that flexibility lasts through September 30, 2030.
But does this flexibility mean less oversight? Your sources touch on that too, I think.
Yes, they do. The material indicates that even with this flexibility, Title X includes requirements for congressional oversight.
Such as?
For instance, the Commandant has to notify the relevant congressional committees at least a week before any procurement actions that might impact costs or timelines.
Okay, a heads-up requirement.
And a detailed expenditure plan is required within 90 days of the bill becoming law. That plan needs to include project timelines, locations for funded projects.
And they still have to comply with existing reporting rules under Title 14 and other laws.
Right, so the picture presented in your sources is kind of a balancing act, aiming for speed and flexibility in getting assets, but pairing that with rules to keep Congress in the loop about the process and the spending.
Okay. Let's shift gears slightly, still within the Coast Guard section. Your sources flag another pretty significant change, this one about the Coast Guard Selected Reserve. Section 10000. What's new there?
This section introduces something quite specific, a new authority for the involuntary activation of selected reserve members.
Involuntary activation, that sounds noteworthy.
It is. The material presents this as a distinct legislative basis, separate from general emergency call-ups, for compelling reservists on active duty for specific, designated needs.
And what's the defined purpose for this new power, according to the sources?
It's stated as augmenting the active forces for pre-planned missions.
Pre-planned missions like?
Specifically, including, again, securing maritime borders and interdicting migrants and drugs.
Ah, so it connects directly back to those operational priorities we discussed for the new cutters, like the OPCs.
Exactly. The bill seems to be linking reserve manpower directly to those priority missions, based on the text you shared.
Now, this new authority, it's not a blank check, right? Your sources mention limits.
Correct. Several limitations are detailed in your material. An involuntary order under this specific new section can't go beyond 365 consecutive days.
1 year max.
And crucially, its use depends on the manpower and the costs being specifically included and identified in the budget materials that go to Congress.
So Congress has to see it coming in the budget request.
Yes, and those budget materials have to describe the mission they anticipate using reservists for and how long they expect that involuntary order to last.
Which provides a way for Congress to oversee how this new power is used, according to the sources.
That's the mechanism described. Another interesting detail from your material. Members activated under this specific authority are explicitly excluded from counting towards the authorized active duty strength limits.
Huh. What does that imply? What's the likely intent there?
Well, based on how it's structured in your sources, it suggests the goal is to let the Coast Guard tap into the reserve for surge needs in these specific missions.
Without bumping up against the overall personnel cap set for the active force.
Right. It seems like a way to add operational capacity for defined missions outside the constraints of the usual active duty staffing numbers.
The bill also makes them consider certain factors when picking who gets called up involuntarily, doesn't it?
Yes, your sources list things like a member's previous service, how often they've been assigned, family responsibilities, and whether their civilian job is crucial for national health, safety, or interest.
So, some criteria for selection.
And beyond that, your sources note that Title X actually amends other parts of the U.S. Code.
Why?
To make sure that service under this new involuntary activation authority meshes smoothly with all the existing benefits and rights.
Like what kind of benefits?
Things like mandatory benefits programs, reemployment rights after service, medical and dental care, health benefits, even age and service requirements for retirement.
Okay, so it seems designed, based on the details in your material, to ensure reservists called up under this specific new power get the same protections as those activated under other existing authorities.
That appears to be the intent reflected in the text.
All right, let's move on. Let's turn our focus now to the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. Your sources show Title X, Section 10008, also sends significant funding their way for fiscal year 2025.
Yes, and the purpose stated for this FAA funding is pretty clear in your sources. It seems very directly aligned with the goals of recent aviation legislation.
How so?
The appropriations are specifically for acquiring, constructing, sustaining, improving, and operating facilities and equipment. The key phrase being necessary to improve or maintain aviation safety, plus related personnel costs.
And your sources explicitly connect this to the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024?
They do. The specific investments detailed in the material really underline that connection.
What kind of investments are we talking about?
Well, there's $2,160,000,000 for replacing air traffic control towers and TRECON facilities. That's Terminal Radar Approach Control. And it includes specific funding for the contract tower program, too.
Okay, replacing aging towers. What else?
$3 billion,
Sure.
$3 million for replacing radar systems, and a really big chunk, $4,750,000,000 for replacing telecommunications infrastructure and systems.
So fundamental air traffic management and safety infrastructure upgrades.
Exactly. And what's particularly interesting, and a very clear sign of alignment according to your sources, is how some funding is explicitly earmarked.
Earmarked how?
Take the money for runway safety projects and airport surface surveillance projects. There's $500 million provided for that.
Okay.
And your material states this amount is specifically to carry out Section 347 of the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024.
So Title X is literally providing the cash to execute specific parts of that other big law focused on airport surface safety.
Precisely. It's a direct link.
Huh.
And it's not just Section 347.
No, what else?
Your sources also detail funding explicitly to carry out Section 619 of that same FAA Reauthorization Act that's $300 million, and another $260 million to carry out Section 44745 of Title 49.
Section 44745. What's that generally about?
That section of Title 49 relates to identifying and dealing with unsafe aircraft.
So funding tied directly to aircraft safety oversight.
Right. This kind of direct referencing in the funding language really shows, according to your sources, that Title X is providing the resources needed to implement key pieces of that recent FAA reauthorization.
Got it. And finally, under the FAA section, your sources show another $1 billion allocated for something else.
Yes, for air traffic control recruitment, retention, training, and importantly, advanced training technologies.
What does adding this personnel funding alongside the infrastructure money signify?
Well, it highlights that the material recognizes that the people, the human capital, are just as fundamental to aviation safety as the equipment. It's an investment in the controllers who run the systems being upgraded.
Makes sense. And like the Coast Guard section, there's oversight here too.
Yes, the FAA administrator is required to submit quarterly reports to Congress detailing how the money under this section is being spent. Reinforces that theme of transparency for these big investments.
Okay, let's pivot to a different area covered in Title X, also detailed in your sources. New fees for vehicles.
Right, these are new annual registration fees set up in sections 104 and 137.5. For certain types of motor vehicles.
Which vehicles specifically and how much?
Okay, the fees are set at specific yearly amounts. It's $250 per year for what they call a covered electric vehicle.
It's dubbed as?
Having an electric motor as its only means of propulsion.
Okay, pure EVs and the other category.
That's $100 per year for a covered hybrid vehicle, defined as having a combination of an electric motor and an internal combustion engine.
Got it. Are there exclusions?
Yes.
Oh.
Your sources are clear that covered farm vehicles and commercial motor vehicles are excluded from these fees.
And these fee amounts, $250 and $100, are they fixed?
No, they're subject to annual increases based on the Consumer Price Index,
Okay.
To keep pace with inflation.
And is this permanent?
Your sources say these fees are set to terminate, to end, on October 1st, 2035.
Okay, so a sunset date. Who's responsible for collecting these new fees?
The material points to the state motor vehicle departments, the DMV or equivalent.
And how are they supposed to do it?
They have to incorporate the collection into their existing registration or renewal processes. Or they can use an alternative method if it's approved by the administrator of the Federal Highway Administration.
And what happens with the money once the state collects it?
The states have to send the collected fees, minus a small amount they can keep for administrative costs.
How much can they keep?
Up to 1%, but only if they're compliant with the rules. They remit the rest monthly to the Federal Highway Administrator.
And if a state doesn't comply?
Your sources mention potential consequences, like the withholding of some federal highway funds.
So there's an enforcement mechanism. Does the bill help states set this up? It sounds like a new administrative task.
Yes, your sources mention grants are available to states, $104 million in total, with a cap of $2 million per state, specifically to help them implement this new collection process.
Okay, some seed money for the states.
And there are also requirements mentioned for the administrator to issue regulations and guidance.
So the big question, why these fees? Where does the money actually go?
According to your sources, Section 105 is very explicit about this. It states that the amounts collected from these fees shall be deposited into the Highway Trust Fund.
And the Highway Trust Fund, as defined in your sources, is?
It's the main pot of money the federal government uses to finance most federal highway construction and mass transit projects.
So, based only on the information in your material, the clear intended purpose here is to create a new revenue stream from EVs and hybrids.
And channel it directly into that fund, a new funding mechanism identified in Title X.
Now, it's really important here to note what your sources don't say about these fees, right?
Absolutely crucial. They explicitly state they do not contain any information, analysis, or discussion about potential socioeconomic impacts or geographic impacts.
Like whether these fees might affect certain groups, say low-income drivers or rural drivers, differently.
Correct. Nor do they discuss any broader shifts in transportation policy that might be reflected here beyond just establishing this specific funding mechanism for the Highway Trust Fund.
So we have to stick strictly to the facts presented.
Yeah,
New fees on EV hybrids, money goes to the Highway Trust Fund. That's what the sources tell us.
precisely.
Okay, finally, let's look at one more section of Title X that, according to your sources, presents a really striking contrast in funding decisions. It seems to highlight legislative priorities based solely on the actions taken.
Right, this involves Section 100.009 and Section 100.007. Let's start with 100.009.
That section provides a pretty significant appropriation for the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. For fiscal year 2025, how much?
Over $256 million in total.
And what do your sources say this money is primarily earmarked for?
The breakdown in your material shows a very strong focus on the physical building itself. Over $241 million is specifically for necessary expenses for the capital repair and restoration of the building and site.
So mostly for fixing up the building.
Yes. Smaller amounts are listed for operation, maintenance, security, and admin expenses. And your sources note these funds are in addition to other money the center might get.
Okay, a substantial investment in the physical infrastructure of the Kennedy Center. Now, contrast that with Section 1000-7. What does it do?
Section 1007 is explicitly titled IRA rescissions, and it mandates the permanent rescission of unobligated balances from several specific programs.
Okay, rescission means canceling funds, right? Specifically, unobligated balances, money that was appropriated but hadn't actually been committed or spent yet.
Exactly. That money is being permanently taken back, made unavailable.
And your sources list the programs being hit by these rescissions.
They do, and several of them have titles that clearly mention terms related to climate or environmental initiatives.
Such as
Things like the Alternative Fuel and Low-Emission Aviation Technology Program, use of low-carbon materials for federal building assistance, environmental review implementation funds, and low-carbon transportation materials grants.
And the section title itself, IRA rescissions, links these actions back to funds originally provided under the Inflation Reduction Act.
Correct. So your sources present this juxtaposition very clearly. A big chunk of new money for the Kennedy Center, mainly for building repairs.
Alongside the cancellation of unspent funds from these specific programs, many with titles suggesting climate or environmental goals and links to the IRA.
So what can we infer about legislative priorities based solely on these contrasting actions, as the sources sort of invite us to consider?
Well, based strictly on what's described in your material, two main points seem to emerge regarding priorities. First, there's a clear priority placed on the physical state of the Kennedy Center.
Right. Its repair and restoration are deemed important enough for that substantial appropriation in Title X.
And second,
There appears to be a, well, lower priority signed, at least to the unspent portions of funding, for those specific programs whose money is being rescinded.
especially when compared to areas getting new appropriations, like the Kennedy Center or the Coast Guard and FAA modernization we talked about earlier.
The sources basically highlight this contrasting treatment of different spending areas as a key observation from Title X.
And again, we have to stress what your sources are very clear they don't cover here.
Absolutely. They explicitly state they offer no analysis on the symbolic meaning or cultural significance of the Kennedy Center funding.
They don't discuss it in the context of overall government spending or infrastructure priorities.
They don't try to explain why this contrast exists or get into the political or economic motivations behind either the Kennedy Center funding or the rescissions.
We are strictly sticking to the factual actions described in the source material you provided. A funds B, and D funds C and D. That's what the text shows. Okay, so if we try to zoom out now and maybe connect some threads from Title X, based on everything we've discussed from your sources, what are some overarching themes?
Looking across the material you provided, I think one clear theme is this prioritization of modernization and getting new assets.
We saw that across different areas, didn't we?
Yeah, from the Coast Guard cutters, especially the polar ones for border security and Arctic presence, all the way to the FAA infrastructure needed for aviation safety. It suggests a legislative focus within this particular title on updating and enhancing core operational capabilities.
And what about how they're doing it? The process?
Well, we also saw these targeted approaches to procurement for certain really critical assets.
Like the flexibility for the icebreakers and the dry dock.
Right. That suggests, according to the sources, a legislative intent to maybe speed up acquisition by allowing different methods.
But balanced, as you said, with attempts to maintain oversight and accountability.
Yes, through those reporting requirements and checks that are detailed in your sources. So this kind of interplay, pushing for modernization, allowing flexibility where it seems needed, but also requiring reporting seems to be a key characteristic of how Title X handles these specific investments based on the material.
Okay, so just to recap our deep dive into Title X based entirely on your sources, we explored major investments in the Coast Guard fleet and support infrastructure with a big emphasis on polar capabilities and that crucial new dry dock.
We looked at that new specific authority for involuntarily activating Coast Guard reservists for certain pre-planned missions, like border security and drug interdiction.
We covered the huge funding injection for FAA modernization, focused on aviation safety, and saw how the funding language explicitly links to implementing points of the recent FAA Reauthorization Act.
We detailed the creation of those new annual registration series for electric and hybrid vehicles, and crucially, how the sources state that money is specifically earmarked for the Highway Trust Fund.
And finally, we examined that striking contract presented in the sources. Significant funding for the Kennedy Center's physical repairs versus the permanent cancellation of unspent funds from several programs, many linked by title to climate or environmental goals, and the IRA, all based only on the actions documented.
Right. Each piece offers a small window into the legislative priorities and operational strategies laid out just within this single title of the Act, relying solely on the information and interpretations presented in the source material you brought to our study hall today.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on based strictly on what these sources have shown us today. Title X directs a lot of money towards both maintaining existing critical physical infrastructure, think the Kennedy Center building, Coast Guard bases, and also towards acquiring new operational assets, new cutters, new FAA systems. Given that context, and remembering those specific programs whose unspent funds were rescinded, what questions does this particular combination of funding and defunding decisions raise for you about the balance the legislature is striking? The balance between maintaining what we have, buying new capabilities, and supporting specific technological or, say, environmental initiatives, based only on the actions detailed in these sources we discussed.
It's definitely something to consider just looking at the choices reflected in the text itself.
A lot packed into just one title. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Title X.
We hope it helps you feel better informed and maybe sparks a few more questions for your own digging.